Welcome to Films and Stuff with your hosts, Pete Mitchell and Ethan Hunt.
Hi, everybody. Welcome back to a very special Films and Stuff podcast. I'm Ethan, joined with Pete, and we are overjoyed to be talking about Transformers today.
That's right. How are you this week?
Everything is great. We had a very, very climactic run-up to Transformers, Rise of the Beasts, and that is what this episode will be discussing. Pete, started off in terms of your enthusiasm for what is now the 7th installment of the Transformers franchise.
Yeah, the Bayverse, right?
Bayham.
I mean, very frankly speaking, I haven't been excited for a Transformers movie in a long time. I think that every time they release one, after the third, maybe actually, I take that back, maybe after the second one, and we're talking now 10 years ago, every time they released one and it made however much money it's made, it always kind of blew me away. That, forgive my language, but that turd made $1 billion? How's that possible?
So let's go back in the chronology to put this in perspective, right?
Yeah, actually, you're raising a good point. Before we start talking about this, listeners, Ethan did something unbelievably brave. He did something really heroic. He watched every Transformer movie that preceded this one, which is something that I would not advise you to do.
611 minutes of film watching, mostly between the hours of midnight and 3 a.m. this week to prepare for this. Let me give a quick primer in terms of how we got here. Paramount and DreamWorks teamed up with Michael Bay for 5 Transformers movies. Transformers had a Rotten Tomatoes rating of 57%, audience 85%. Not bad. The sequel to that, Revenge of the Fallen, rating of 20%, audience dipped to 57%. You're going to see a trend here. 2 years later, Dark of the Moon came. This had a 35%, 55% rating. 3 years later, Age of Extinction, ratings of 18% on Rotten Tomatoes, 50% by audiences. Number 5 happened again another 3 years later, called The Last Night, dipped to 16%, 43% rating. 1 year later, Bumblebee came out. This one fixed a lot of things, 91%, 74%. And now, 5 years later, the longest time lapse, we have Transformers Rise of the Beasts. And so far, the ratings have been okay. And that's kind of how we got to where we are.
And Bumblebee and this current movie, Rise of the Beast, I'm probably going to refer to it as Beast Wars inadvertently because that's what this movie was based on.
Let's call it Beast Wars. It's a lot easier to say for me.
Yeah. So both of these movies are prequels to the first 5 movies, correct?
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right. Bumblebee was clearly set in 1984. They did not come across Wonder Woman or Chris Pine. And then Beast Wars apparently is 10 years later in 1994. And I think you said it correctly, which is, for me, the first 3, right, the original Shia LaBeouf movies were very enjoyable experiences. Prototypical what you think of as Michael Bay as a director. A lot of pyrotechnics, a lot of military, a lot of emotion. They were fun. You had to suspend belief a little bit, but you definitely walked out of that movie with a smile on your face, and it was good fun. I thought the first 3 were really, really enjoyable. We could nitpick about them, but again, he's not trying to win Academy Awards. He's trying to entertain audiences. I thought the first 3 were absolutely good. Then when you go to Age of Extinction, which is the 4th, that to me is a movie that if you just kind of like detach your brain a little bit and you go with the flow, you can enjoy it. It definitely undermines a lot of things that you thought you knew in the first 3 movies. It's like the antithesis of Marvel, right? We watch a Marvel movie and every movie is very, very structured and very consistent with what the prior movie is. And either it explains something that was previously unexplained, or it continues something and there's exceptional continuity or consistency among those movies. Transformers has no such morals about remaining loyal to their prior movie. 1, 2, and 3 were generally on the same timeline. 4 was inconsistent, which is the Age of Extinction. The Last Night was where you just threw your hands up and said, hold on, just hold on. I've been giving you the benefit of the doubt. I cannot, in good faith, go with this story anymore. You have just perverted it too much. Nothing that I saw in the previous 4 matters. You have undone everything. And I think that's why that movie had such a low rating. It wasn't because of the production value. It was because it essentially said everything else that you've been watching. It's not just a lie. It just actively undid all the other things that it had set up for the prior 10 years. Bumblebee came back, and because it was a prequel, because it had John Cena, who's very likable, it kind of fixed it a little bit in the sense that it didn't get into what was the history of these movies. It kind of went with the flow. And I think as a standalone movie, Bumblebee, as evidenced by the audience ratings, really rehabilitated the franchise a little bit. And Bumblebee's always been kind of the most likable / least racist of the robots. And now we've got Beast Wars. And that's where I want to ask you, Pete, what was your mindset going into Beast Wars, knowing that it's been a 5-year layoff and knowing the carnage that, Michael Bay has left for this movie to try to pick up the pieces and put together a coherent storyline?
I have a couple of thoughts on the franchise on a macro level, let's say high level. I think that Michael Bay did a relatively good job of A, modernizing the Transformers, and B, kind of, almost like James Cameron, bringing that CGI technology to the forefront. On that regard, I thought that his work was a success. The franchise was kind of in Hasbro's hands, a hodgepodge. I think that they were just like, okay, let's throw this character. Let's throw this character in. Let's do this. Let's do this action sequence. It's almost as if they were going from beat to beat without a proper storyline. And Bumblebee kind of scaled all that back because they said, look, we're not going to have 20 different Transformers in here. We're really just going to focus on one of them. There's not going to be a crazy B plot. There's not going to be a crazy C plot. We're not so worried about the lore of the Transformers because by now most of the audience is aware what the Transformers are, so you don't have to really repeat anything. And you certainly don't have to rewrite history, which is, as you rightly said, what the Transformers have done quite frequently in the past. Yeah. And I think that by the end of this movie, it's clear to me that Hasbro has taken a page out of the Marvel book and potentially the DC book, which is to say, we want to focus on creating a shared universe. You saw this film today at the time of recording.
That's right.
I saw this film 2 days ago. I just said, hey, there's no end credit sequence. There's a mid-credit sequence, but the mid-credit sequence happens almost immediately, so you don't have to stick around too long.
Right.
And the very last scene in the movie, before the credits roll, almost seems like it should have been an end credit sequence.
Yeah.
Where, we might as well talk about it. Let's talk about spoilers. Spoilers.
Yep.
So the very end credit, we learn that the protagonist of this movie, Noah, is looking for a job. He goes to an interview. The interview isn't with a real company. It's with a secret government organization. And here's the first and probably the only twist that the movie does that I actually really liked. I thought this was going to be Sector 7. I thought that he was going to end up working for them, and I thought, hey, that's a great way of tying this movie in with Transformers 1, 2, and 3.
Agree.
I thought that would have been fine. I thought that story was over, but instead we learned that, dun, 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 he's applying for a job with G.I.
G.I.
Joe.
Joe.
Which is, it blew my mind when I saw the card, right? Because they didn't reveal the name. They just opened it up. You see some cool looking tech in the background, but you're just like, oh yeah, that could definitely be Sector 7 or 8 or whatever it's called. It blew my mind because, and I know the movies aren't high art, but I actually really enjoyed the live action G.I. Joe movies. And I know that they were not well received and they didn't do well. And Channing Tatum hated doing the movies, but he was forced to do it. All of that I understand.
Yeah.
But I grew up playing with the G.I. Joe toys way more than I did with the Transformers toys.
Yeah.
I had the original G.I. Joe toys, which were like the 10-inch size ones before they went to the 4-inch size ones or 3-inch size ones. I had all of them. I had the little carrier. I had the armored personnel vehicles, all of that. I loved them. And to see all that on screen, it was really fun for me. So when I saw that crossover, or at least the potential for a crossover, I was super excited. Again, do I think these movies are great? Probably not. I mean, objectively, or maybe not objectively, but critically speaking, of course they're not. The 5-year-old, 6-year-old boy in me came screaming out happy with that.
I have to say, I agree with you that the mid-credit sequence where they introduced G.I. Joe was pretty cool. I echo everything you say about it, but the movie as a whole, I thought was disappointing.
Oh, yeah.
In the sense that it was unimaginative and very joyless. And when I say unimaginative, I mean, this is 2023, and we have, once again, a portal in the sky where bad guys are coming. I mean, I have to say, I thought this portal in the sky idea was done like 6 years ago with kind of like the Avengers. We're back to the portal in the sky. That's what I mean about unimaginative. And we'll get to the rest of the plot, which was kind of incoherent, but joyless in the sense that, and I know that Shia LaBeouf is listening, I've never really felt engaged to him as like a person or an actor. But when you watch those original Transformers, he is extraordinarily likable. He has a very good balance of kind of being a buffoon and silly, but at the same time serious, and you feel a little bit of sympathy for him. The balance that he plays to achieve that, I thought was exceptional, and his comedic chops in those first 3 movies, I think, makes them, coupled with Michael Bay's very, very good use of the military to make these feel more like G.I. Joe movies and kind of less like superhero movies. Whereas I thought this movie itself, there's no military whatsoever. It is entirely based on the Transformers. Anthony Ramos, who plays Noah, and Dominique Fishback, who plays Elena, are really the only humans that we see in this movie, for the most part.
And I didn't really like Dominique Fishback.
There's no likability, to be honest, for either one of them. And there's certainly, I don't even think they're trying to have any romantic chemistry. There was one scene where Noah was kind of like holding her head and seeing if she was okay. But like, there's no spark at all. I don't think they're even trying to have a spark. And neither one of them, to be honest, even tried to be funny. I thought it was really disappointing from an entertainment perspective.
Yeah, I agree with you. So let me preface what I'm about to say also by saying that, hey, that G.I. Joe reveal at the end, that does not make up for the rest of this movie. I just thought that was a bright spot in what I think would have been otherwise a very average to mediocre movie overall. But within the Transformers universe, I would say one of the better movies. And I'll get to why. But talking about Noah, and let's talk about Anthony Ramos and Danielle Fishback first. So first of all, no chemistry. And yes, when we say no chemistry, we're not looking for just romantic chemistry, but chemistry in the sense like there should be a sense of camaraderie between these two, right?
Can I say what we mean is when you see Kevin Hart and The Rock on
Yes.
screen, no one thinks they're going to kiss. No one wants them to kiss, but they definitely play off each other very, very well, right? That's the type of on-screen chemistry that if you're not going to have a romantic relationship, some type of other
something. And they didn't have it. And they tried that first sequence when they meet each other at the museum and he's there to rob her.
Yeah.
And she's kind of putting up a front and this. I get what they were trying to do there. They were trying to do a little bit of slapsticky kind of comedy, but it didn't work for me. It did not land for me. When you think about it, they're the only two human leads in this movie. The stakes for humankind are as high as it could possibly be.
Yeah.
So when that's the case, you would hope that the only two people who represent humanity and the species would at least get along in such a sense that they're believable as we have to work together to do this, right? And I get it. Like, you want to be, I'm a pacifist. I don't think we should destroy it. I'm this, I'm that. That's fine. But I don't know. I just didn't find that they worked well together on screen. I'm not saying that they're not good. I'm just saying that they just didn't work well together on screen. And I don't think that in the grand scheme of things, she comes off as someone who appreciates what the stakes actually are in this. So I found that to be less believable.
Let me start Noah first. I think Anthony Ramos was a very serviceable actor. I kind of wish we would have seen a little bit more of his backstory in terms of military and maybe see him be like dishonorably discharged because he, let's say he took like an extra few days of leave to like stay with his brother, like something that it kind of alluded to the fact that he did something wrong and he couldn't be trusted. He was a bad teammate, why he didn't get his first job. But if we would have seen him more as like any of the G.I. Joe casts that we've seen, even the Josh Duhamel as Lennox that we've seen in prior G.I. Joes, if we would have seen him in a little bit more of a battle scenes at the beginning, I think it would have improved his military chops. We just kind of knew that he was ex-military. Then he was looking for a job as a security guard. I thought he did a very fine job with this role. He just didn't have the same level of humor, and that's okay, but then you should have given him more military cred.
Yes.
So I think that's a bad positioning choice there because he was actually okay in a lot of action scenes, and he was actually kind of likable, and you had sympathy for him who's taking care of his brother and trying to hold the family stuff together. Honestly, that's very Michael Bay tear-jerking stuff. I just think they should have focused more on his military cred and kind of his discharge at the beginning. It would have set the scene a little bit better.
Yeah, especially because, I mean, since we're talking about spoilers, he basically becomes Hasbro's version of Discount Iron Man at the end of this movie.
Yeah, that's right.
And we don't know what his military credentials are. We just know that he was discharged. So he could have been a tech guy for all we know. He could have been the cook for all we know. He could have been a general.
He was the tech guy. They said that he's got a background. I think they said like electronics wizard or something.
Sure,
right?
That's fine. But if that's the case,
they didn't show that skill at all.
You don't see any of that skill. In fact, I think what would have been great is if he's trying to break into Mirage the first time, and then he's like, hold on, I cooked something up that I thought would be helpful. And he pulls out a device that he built that unlocks the car automatically. And
so good.
And even the Transformers are amazed that he's got technology that could bypass Cybertronian things. A, I think that would have been better. And B,
good idea.
Then how do you put him into an Iron Man suit and then have him be like this super fighter? Like even in Iron Man 1, they go out of their way to show you Tony training and becoming through this montage of learning how to become an Iron Man.
We saw that in what's the other recent Marvel movie where the lady became the Iron Man equivalent as well. And I think you had the exact same
Wakanda Forever, where
maybe it was Wakanda Forever. And you said the same thing, which is she just got this and she's an expert at it, as good as anyone. You know, Tony Stark, who designed it himself, was practicing in his own garage, scorching everything.
Learning how to fly, learning
Yeah.
how to do all this stuff.
Yeah.
And all I'm saying is that
Set the scene
lean
better.
into the background,
Yeah.
give us a little bit of credibility to the character. I 100% would have believed him to be capable of doing all of those things if you told me he was a Marine and that,
Yes.
he was
Yes.
discharged because he disobeyed orders.
How about stealing medicine for his brother? Let's say
Sure.
that something where like he broke into something or he forged some documents to get medicine for his brother because his insurance wouldn't cover it. He got discharged. Suddenly you're like, whoa, what
Yeah.
a sympathetic guy. And he's a military expert. Much more believable, right?
I mean, this is going to be a throwback, but you remember in Ant-Man 1, we learned that the reason Scott is in prison is because he hacked into a company, found out they were doing unethical practices, and he releases that information to the public.
Yep.
And that's why he goes to jail. But
that's right.
Not only do we learn that not only is he a good guy, but that he's also capable with tech. So when you see him break into the house to steal the suit, you can understand that, hey, this makes sense. He's done this in the past. He understands how to bypass security locks, and he's a smart guy.
Yep.
So in this case, they took a leap without explaining to us or without showing us what that step should have been.
That's my feeling on Anthony Ramos, a very serviceable Noah, but I think that they did not fill in his backstory enough. They could have done a much better job to make him a more compelling character. Then in terms of Dominique Fishback, they kind of made her like this hieroglyphics type expert. She's supposed to be their historian.
No, but that's the thing. She's just the aide. She's not even the historian.
No, she's an intern because Sarah Stiles calls her, hey, intern. I tried paging you. You didn't pick up. Hey, intern.
And then obviously she's the intern who's got the skills and they rely on her to authenticate, right? Like the trope is that the boss is actually incompetent and she relies on her intern to tell her what the true story is.
Right.
Fine. That's also okay. But why is she just an intern? We don't get any real backstory on that.
Yeah.
How is she actually so smart? We don't get any backstory to that. She's never really left Brooklyn before or New York before, but she's all of a sudden on this plane going to Peru, and she's an expert on hieroglyphics. So, for someone who's afraid of leaving New York, archaeology, and that too Egyptian archaeology, maybe not the first field that you should go into.
Again, it's about character creation. I just didn't watch this and I wasn't like rooting for her. I certainly didn't see her as, the person who could figure out the code. I certainly didn't see her as a person who would be involved in anything physical at all. There's no romantic interest between, the characters. It was just either a miscast choice or it was they didn't give enough character background.
So I always give the actors the benefit of the doubt. I would say the first blame probably comes towards the writers / directors / producers to say, hey, you didn't flesh out the character enough in your script. Again, I'll give her the benefit of the doubt. I just didn't find her compelling. And I don't want to blame her. I would say this is probably the fact that they just didn't really think through the characters enough.
You don't have from Elena, the character, any type of, I'm really, really intelligent. This is my area. You get a little bit of backstory about her father, who was a cab driver and passed away. But okay, that's sympathetic, but that's not relevant at all to the story. Your dad wasn't like an explorer. He wasn't like a witwicky. He wasn't anything like that. I just said that out loud. That would have been great. He could have been with the Witwickens, and my great-grandfather was actually a supporter of this Antarctic venture and tied together somehow. None of that at all.
Right.
Nothing.
What did you think of, let's take a step back from the actors. What did you think of the movie itself on a grand scheme? What did you think of the premise? What did you feel?
At a high level, you can follow the plot.
Yeah.
And that's positive. Even I think my mom could follow the plot. We'll probably get into this later in the episode. At a granular level, it does not make sense, or a few key decisions could have resolved this whole issue a couple centuries ago. In terms of like entertainment value, I mean, the CGI is exceptional, the action is exceptional, but I have to say, like, this is why I called it unimaginative. I've seen really exceptional CGI before. There was no particular scene or move or anything that I thought was, wow, I haven't seen that before. It was the same old, kind of like Black Panther, Wakanda Forever, a million little creatures in kind of like a barren desert scene fighting a few of the good guys. The good guys are dramatically overpowered. It seems like they're going to lose. And then somehow, some way, immediately the tide turns. Yawn. I mean, it's just wasn't innovative. But in terms of like watchability, yeah, like you can watch through it and still follow and enjoy it for what it is, I guess.
I thought that the movie was way better than I expected it to be. I wasn't expecting a coherent story and B, a relatively tightly paced movie, because it seemed like the movie was moving fast. And for a Transformers movie, I think that's the right pace. I think you want a movie to be not just action-packed, but continually moving along at a clip, because I don't think that the writing or the storylines would stand up to any kind of scrutiny inside the theater. Like, I think if you had a lull and you had to think about what was actually being said on screen and shown on screen, I think immediately the House of Cards would fall apart.
Yeah.
2, it's not exactly like Transformers movies are known for their greatly philosophical takes on life.
Yeah.
These are action movies that are built for 2 demographics. One, it's the younger age kids.
Yeah.
And the other is people like you and me who are nostalgic for the Transformers of the 80s when it first came out, right? Here's the problem I had with the movie. In this universe, this is a prequel. We already know what happens to every one of these characters. At no point do I feel like any of these characters are going to die forever, because
there's no stakes.
There's no stakes. And the reason is because in 2007's Transformers, Bumblebee exists, Optimus Prime exists, all of these guys exist. So when you know that they're going to exist in a movie that you've already seen, and this movie is set 10, 12 years before the first one, the scene where Bumblebee comes back to life, well, duh. How was he not going to come back to life? And if not in this movie, definitely in the next movie.
Well, Pete, you make a good point, but I have to say, I think it's part of it is wrong. Because why did Mirage live in this movie and we don't see him then in Transformers 1? That means he's going to have to die in a subsequent movie. The Dinobots as well. I mean, like, I agree with you. Like, we know who's not going to die, but it also seemed a little bit like, I guess there's going to be 2 more of these. There's got to be some deaths between now and the original, right?
So totally, I agree with you. My point is that maybe they won't die. Maybe in the next movie, they're going to get sent to Cybertron or whatever. Look, they're always doing something to mess with the continuity, right?
Yeah.
But you cannot mess with the continuity of someone like Bumblebee,
right,
or of Optimus Prime. You could theoretically do it with anybody else, but you can't do it with those 2 because they are the 2 biggest fan favorites.
Yeah.
And when you've seen them already in the first 3 movies, like, at no point do I ever think that Bumblebee is going to kick the bucket.
Yeah.
So that's the problem I have with these kinds of things, is because you feel a bit robbed of that sense of tension and dramatic reveal. However, having said that, and we didn't talk about this like we normally do, I saw this on Friday morning.
Yeah.
There must have been 30 people in the cinema. So not full, but certainly not empty either.
Yeah.
And the people who were all in there huge fans of the franchise. And you know how I know that is because they were hooting and hollering.
Really?
The moment you see Bumblebee come flying out of the airplane at that last battle scene, and he becomes the literal Deus Ex Machina that destroys the other side. Like in one Transformer was all it took, and it was Bumblebee, and people lost their goddamned minds in the theater.
That's crazy.
It was unbelievable. Again, I don't know if it's an Indian thing, but I haven't seen people react to movies like this in a long time in the theater. Probably the only time I saw that was in Infinity War and in Endgame. But really, it made me feel so happy to have watched that, even though the cinema wasn't full. I wasn't hooting and hollering. And it certainly didn't make me feel like hooting and hollering because I saw that scene coming. But I really appreciated that there were people in the cinema who were so happy at that sequence. What about you? So we didn't talk about this. What was your screening like?
I was the only person there.
Oh.
but to be fair, so a few caveats. I saw this at 10 a.m. in the morning on a Sunday, which is not prime date night time. And I was considering between two cinemas, one more of a standard cinema. When I went online, it looked as though about 50% of the seats were sold. And they were all kind of like the middle seats. And I expected that was going to be groups of kids. So instead, I went to a different cinema, the more platinum level cinema. I was the only person there, but that only holds 24 people. So it's not that unusual, but the other one did seem to have about 50% of the seats sold out, and only kind of like the ends, where you'd be craning your neck the whole time, were available, to be fair.
Yeah.
I don't want to say they're complaints, but they're things that bother me.
Okay.
The first one is that having watched 7 Transformers movies, I feel that I could not really explain the powers of Transformers or the hierarchy in terms of their capabilities or how they are injured or die. Right. Some of that is, this is a fantasy movie. It is a movie. The laws of natural physics are not going to apply, but still generally, I feel like there should be a framework in terms of what are powers, to be honest. It's not at all clear how anyone kind of got their powers and why people are in the shapes that they are. The Bumblebee story was that Bumblebee kind of came to Earth as a robot, and that he had the ability when he scanned something to turn into that mechanical object. And that is a premise I think is very, very good. It makes you wonder why he initially, he chose, I guess, a Volkswagen Bug to kind of like stay under the scenes and to be anonymous. And then later he chose a pretty crappy Corvette, I guess, so that he was inexpensive enough for Shia LaBeouf's dad to afford him. But after that, he just kind of always stayed as a yellow Corvette. Yellow, okay, he's always been yellow, but you would wonder why he doesn't take on the shape of a Hummer or, like, to be honest, a more practical vehicle, right? Optimus Prime apparently came, they don't show it, and he scanned a semi-truck. He was a robot, he scanned a semi-truck, he chose to be a semi-truck. Maybe there's some use to that. But again, for all the other folks, there's no clarity in terms of why they chose the shapes that they are, and to be honest, why they would remain at those shapes. I'll put that aside. In terms of fighting, it's also not clear at all what it takes to kill any of these characters. Because in a lot of Transformers movies, we see the military with like guns. Do guns and like normal ordnance, like military grade ordnance, pose a threat or not a threat? You see them shooting each other, and sometimes it's bounces off their armor, and sometimes it's almost debilitating. And then in the opening scene, you see that this original Optimus gorilla was like defeated very, very easily. But then throughout the movie, the villain killed Bumblebee, He couldn't finish off Mirage, kind of took out Prime in one fight scene, then was kind of taken down by Bumblebee. It was very scattered in terms of what it takes to actually like kill someone, other than Prime just kind of saying something motivational and deciding to go all crazy on them. Does that bother you at all?
Kind of does, because it feels like they're things that would normally kill a Transformer just feel like they're steps in an action sequence. Prime gets stabbed in that first battle scene.
Yeah.
As does Bumblebee, but Bumblebee dies.
Yeah.
Prime doesn't. So I didn't understand that. Scourge, we see get his face literally put into a wall of lava by Prime. That didn't kill him.
No.
But he gets stabbed in the chest and shot. That, I guess, does. I don't know. I take your points fully, and I think those are actually very valid points, but I very quickly kind of filed them under this is a movie about robots from space, so it doesn't really make a difference.
And then my second point is, let's just go through the plot.
Okay.
So we see a prehistoric Earth.
That wasn't Earth. That was the home where the Beast guys were from.
Is that right?
Yeah, because they escaped in a rocket ship.
So they took the key and they escaped in a rocket ship, and the rocket ship went to Earth?
Yeah, well, I assume they used the transwarp key to transport them to Earth.
Why did they need the rocket ship?
Well, that's a question that's always been true for all Transformers movies.
Right.
Like, you always see them use other vehicles to transport themselves. That never made sense.
Okay. So they took the rocket ship, they escaped, and they went to Earth then with the key?
Yeah, exactly.
Okay. The rocket ship is nowhere to be found. I'll overlook that. They then decided that it would be best to just divide the key in half and hide both pieces, right?
Yeah.
One in Egypt and one in Peru.
Yeah.
But then in Peru, they didn't actually keep it in the hiding space. They decided to give it to a village of locals instead.
Exactly. I can see where you're going with this, by the way.
I mean, I would have thought they should have just destroyed the key. Wouldn't that have kind of solved the problem?
Well, exactly. This entire movie would have stopped, right? That's the MacGuffin of this movie.
Yeah, they weren't trying to go home. They kind of said, hey, no matter what, you got to protect the key, even if we got to stay here forever. Okay, you've committed to staying here forever. Why don't you just destroy the key?
Exactly.
Okay. The one in Egypt is the one that I have, because Egypt, if you look back at Transformers Age of Extinction, remember we found out that the pyramids are actually
sun
housing.
Collectors. Yeah.
Right. Those two storylines, I don't think like jive at all, do they?
Sure.
Yeah.
This is, again, I think one of the biggest problems with the Transformers universe is that they've never had someone sit down with a whiteboard in front of all the writers and say, this has already happened in these movies at these locations for this purpose. So if we go back,
how do you explain this?
You have to explain this. And if you don't want to explain this, then you can't go back to Egypt. It's that simple.
Okay, so I take it. They've got the MacGuffin, whatever. This is their teletransportation device. There's only one. They've taken it to Earth. They decide not to destroy it, which would have solved the whole problem forever. Instead, they divide it in half. One half they leave apparently totally unguarded, and the other half they give to the villagers and I'm going to call them the Dinobots, but they're not. Basically say that they're just going to watch the villagers and make sure the villagers are okay. Therefore, the MacGuffin is okay, right? And the bad guys, the villains, right? Scourge, he cannot, for whatever reason, use his radar to identify this until the Egyptian one came out of its shell. And then when it came out of its shell, then it made a big thing in the sky and he could detect it, right?
Yes.
But the one in Peru, which didn't have a shell, was just in like a piece of loincloth. That one he couldn't find.
Yeah, because they never activated.
And then Prime has always been here.
So question mark there, right? Because in the very first movie, we see Prime land on Earth for the so-called first time.
Right.
And then we see him scan a Mack truck for the very first time and take on the appearance of a Mack truck in the very first movie.
Right. Bumblebee, at least in the movie Bumblebee, Prime sent him specifically to Earth, but not to find this thing. That's just a crazy coincidence. The Prime sent him to Earth to scout a place and take care of the people. Bumblebee is already here. Prime, not clear how he got here, but he apparently is not here for the first time when we see Transformers 1 with Shia LaBeouf in 2007. It doesn't jive, right?
Oh, absolutely not. Unless he leaves.
This is where I was going. I kind of thought, because he talks about time-space continuum, I'm like, this is going to fix everything. Now they've got a time machine. I get it. They're going to fix everything. They're going to go back. And now it's all going to make sense because they're going to go back in time and they're going to fix everything. And now we're going to understand why all this stuff happened. And they're going to create an alternate timeline. They didn't do that at all, though. But they could have fixed that. You know, like Bumblebee died. They could go back previously and do something. Bumblebee never died. Like, I thought they're going to fix all of this.
Yeah.
Okay. So all of this happens. The sky gets very dark. Are humans aware that there are Autobots, Decepticons on Earth now?
Theoretically, G.I. Joe knows about them.
John Cena and the people in
should also
Bumblebee,
know about them.
Right? So when all this stuff happened in the original Transformers 2007, Shia LaBeouf, they all should have been here already, right?
Yes, exactly.
Like everyone would have known about them. It wouldn't be a big surprise somehow.
Exactly.
Okay. It's definitely complicated. I don't want to be like pedantic about it, like, oh, you're no fun, Ethan. But one of the reasons Marvel is, I think, so enjoyable is that the storylines match up and you're always learning and you can put things together. I think one of the reasons this franchise is frustrating for me is that, forget the believability aspect, their storylines just kind of like, they're not loyal to what's happened in the past.
Correct.
Everyone is kind of like a standalone movie. Like, Pete and Ethan saw those other 6, but let's just kind of like, we don't have to be like bound by that. Let's just write it the way that we want for this one, you know?
It's almost episodic TV in the sense that if you didn't watch the first 6 movies, you'd be totally fine in this game.
100%,
in this movie.
100%.
And I think that's the problem, is that they don't have a Kevin Feige sitting in front of everyone explaining that. You're absolutely right. The MCU and now hopefully the DCU, it rewards fans of the franchise.
Right.
If you watch the first movie and then the second movie, you'll get references as you would with most direct sequels. You'll get reference just to the first movie in the second movie.
Yeah.
But the MCU went one step further. If you watch a second or third franchise in that universe, that's not even related to the first movie.
Right. Yeah.
You'll get callbacks. So what they're saying is, hey, we appreciate the fact that Ethan and Pete are fans of Iron Man and Captain America and Thor and Guardians of the Galaxy. Yeah. So when you watch Ant-Man,
it's a loyalty rewards program. It's a loyalty rewards. Yeah.
Totally. So when you watch Ant-Man and they start talking about all these characters and they start, referring to them, that's for Ethan and Pete. That's not for the sake of the story. That's for them saying, hey, you guys, thank you for watching these movies. This is the same thing that's happening in another side of the universe at the same time. So we want to reward you for that.
Yeah.
This movie franchise does not do that. In fact, I actually go the other way. I would go to the other extreme and say it is actually a disservice to fans of the franchise who are there for continuity. I didn't watch The Last Night.
You didn't watch The Last Night?
No, because I skipped it. It was all garbage.
Please watch it. Please, I'm begging you to watch it and write me what is the plot.
Exactly. And so I'm telling you right now, having not seen that, I still was able to walk into this movie, enjoy it, and I don't know if I've missed anything, but I can tell you this, I couldn't care less.
Yeah. I mean, let's talk about what the history kind of was from the original Transformers, right? Shia LaBeouf is a guy called Sam Witwicky. Sam Witwicky's great-great-grandfather was an Antarctic explorer who apparently found a frozen Megatron and the Allspark. And that's how Witwicky got into this. And then when you get to the last night, there is the Order of the Witwickens. And he says, I am the last of the Witwickens.
Which doesn't make sense. Doesn't this take place like in medieval England?
It does, but at the end, then it's real time, and it's Mark Wahlberg is in it again. So it's post 5.
It's post 5, but also why is the order named after the Witwickens if this is 500 years before the Witwickies?
So that's also a good question. But then they show a picture of Sam Witwicky, and the implication is he must have died between episodes 4 and 6.
Okay. I think it's because you and I watch movies and take them a little more seriously than your average movie viewer. And I think that we also are fans of these kinds of franchises that have like stories that go over one movie, over multiple movies.
Right.
And when you have a franchise that does not make sense over many movies, that's a problem. That works in James Bond. Every movie in James Bond movie, even though it's a franchise and even though there's similar characters or same characters across many movies, every James Bond movie is its own movie that's, relatively speaking, unconnected to other movies.
Yeah.
The latest James Bond series with Daniel Craig is totally different because they built it so that it was one long, big story arc in between. That's fine.
You can do that, though, when the storyline of that 2-hour movie revolves around a car chase and shooting one bad villain. You cannot do it when there is a alien portal in Peru that is apparently affecting the entire world.
Yeah.
There was a car chase scene. There was the big shootout by this museum, which I don't know where in Brooklyn that is, that has like so much real estate.
Ellis Island, apparently.
Oh, really?
Which makes even less sense, but yes.
Yeah, it does make even less sense. I mean, it is such a potentially good franchise. And like I said, I thought the first 3 were relatively comprehensible. 4, you could get there. The last night was just, I'm really encouraging you to please watch it because I just want to hear how you explain it to me. Because I was watching this and I was just like, this is bonkers. This is totally bonkers. Like I'm almost being trolled by this movie that said, oh, Ethan, you watched the first 5? Ha ha ha, you sucker. Like that matters not at all. This is a totally new Transformers franchise. None of that matters. Forget everything you thought you knew, except for some things that we tell you are important. But don't worry, we've got Mark Wahlberg in Scotland. And then he's going to jump off a spaceship and he's going to be in Iowa. Don't worry about how. Like, it's totally mind-blowing. Totally mind-blowing.
One last thing before we give our ratings. Yep. I will say that actually my favorite part of this movie, more than anything else, more than the action, more than the sequences, all of that, was the soundtrack. I thought the soundtrack was chef's kiss. A+ for me. It really reminded me of my college days, right?
Yeah.
And I have a sneaking suspicion, although I didn't bother checking, that some of the songs in the soundtrack weren't actually from 1994. They may have been from later. Yeah. But I think they did that because it was kind of like, how do I appeal to Pete, who was around in college at that era, who would be considered one of our target Transformers fans? I know, let's throw in a bunch of De La Soul. Let's throw in a bunch of old
LL Cool J.
LL Cool J. All these classics which we grew up listening to in our college and high school days and just after college. I mean, it was so awesome to hear De La Soul. And, you know, especially when, you know, the leads, I think it was the lead singer, I can't remember. One of the members of De La Soul just passed away very recently. So, you know, it was a double whammy. I was like, oh man, it was so good to hear all of that again.
I agree. The music was quite good. Can we make one more observation before we give ratings?
Of course.
Optimus Prime seems to have the worst decision-making.
Oh, God.
It would almost be as though if Optimus Prime makes a decision, you should do the opposite. We've seen this now in almost every movie. where he is making a decision and it's spectacularly, strategically wrong. And then he will say something like, I promise I will be loyal. I will always stand up for the people of Earth. And then rip the bad guy's head, face, spine out, right?
Yeah.
It has happened so many times. And all of this carnage and all this death and destruction easily could have been remedied if Prime would honestly be a little bit of a better leader. He's a bad decision maker.
Anyway, so what did you think?
As I said at the beginning, this is a absolutely tolerable but joyless film. Had this been a little bit more Michael Bay pyrotechnics and less CGI, I would give it a must see in cinemas. But instead, because this is purely CGI, it's a wait for streaming.
Yeah, I'm 100% with you. I thought the action was okay, but not bombastic enough on that same level to justify watching it in the cinema.
Yeah.
I think this is definitely a wait for streaming. But having said that, I am expecting big news next week for this for the box office take. I think that it's going to do gangbusters business.
I do not.
Based on the reaction I saw in India, I think so. I think early numbers in the US have been very positive. I think that this movie is definitely going to be on the top 10. And I think you and I have probably got this set about right. I think this should be 5 or 6 by the end of the summer.
Everything you say, I would absolutely echo it. I would say it's a soulless movie that will do very well. But something I just realized, The Flash is coming out next week. I don't think Transformers is going to be able to compete with now Spider-Man and Flash coming out. I think it'll have this good weekend. I think that the word of mouth is not going to be great. And I think that when Flash comes out, it's going to drop off dramatically. If The Flash was holding off for 2 more weeks, I would think that it would get a lot more box office success because people would just kind of like shrug and say like, I heard it's not great, but not bad, but I really know it. Let's go see it. I think it's because everyone who's going to see it is going to be like, it's okay. The reviews are going to be like, it's kind of like, okay. And then Flash is going to be the new big thing next weekend. And I think everyone is going to see Flash instead.
Yeah, I would agree with you for the US market and maybe the Western European market. But I think for Asia Pacific, so you've raised a really good point. I was doing a very quick fire analysis of this. After Transformers 1 and Transformers 2 released, right, we saw that when Transformers 1 released, the ratio of the total box office was approximately 1-to-1, which was to say the domestic box office in the US was just a little bit behind the international box office. And the same applied for Transformers 2, Revenge of the Fallen. Where that started changing dramatically, though, was from Dark of the Moon onward. So normally if it was 1x for international to domestic, Transformers Dark of the Moon was 2x. International box office was twice as big as the domestic box office. Age of Extinction was 3.5x. The same applies for Transformers Last Night, and the same applies for Bumblebee, where you're starting to see that the international box office is far more interested in seeing Transformers. This is just on a Transformers basis. I'm not comparing this to superhero movies.
Yeah. So Pete, that is absolutely right statistically. And I agree that probably holds true as a franchise. But one thing that I think bulked those numbers up was, remember, I think it was Age of Extinction. Michael Bay put in that huge Hong Kong, China love letter.
Sure.
And that was, I think, instrumental. Now, whether that carries over because this has nothing interesting for an Asian audience in terms of characters, in terms of plot, in terms of location, possibly just because they've been introduced to it positively by the past. But this does not have any direct nexus. Had they been fighting in Korea rather than Peru, maybe you could say that would have something to do with it, but That is, I think, Michael Bay is kind of brilliant, in the sense that when they put in that.
Yeah, I'm surprised that this portal wasn't in China.
Yeah, it could have been on the Great Wall.
Oh, imagine if they had like a robot chase sequence on the Great Wall.
Yeah.
Like it would have been, again, not good, but it would have been very appealing.
Peru is an interesting, beautiful backdrop, but in terms of relevance to the story or compellingness, I have to say, I'm sure. What's the budget of this? Do you know?
$200 million, $195 million plus print and advertising.
What percentage of that is CGI? It has to be, I'm going to make this up, 90%.
Yeah, I think it's going to be greater than 60, 70% easily.
Look at the cast. All my love for the cast. Yeah. There's no one in that cast
that's commanding $20 million. No one.
The dude who plays the G.I. Joe guy, he is definitely well known. He had a 1-minute scene. He did not make $10 million for that.
No.
Sarah Stiles, who plays kind of the boss to the intern, 1 scene, 1 location. She did not make a huge amount for that. Everyone else, I'm sure they're very well accomplished. Ramos and Fishback did not make huge salaries. There's 2 locations. One of them is Peru, and they're all caves or a mountaintop. It's all CGI that costs for this, right?
Yeah, 100%. I would expect that out of 195 million, probably 150 is CGI.
Yeah. There's just not that much else. So we both give it the rating, wait for streaming, but we think it's going to make a ton of money this summer.
It's going to be a top 10 for sure. They're printing money, and on top of that, now that they've introduced the concept of a shared universe with G.I. Joe, I mean, kudos to Hasbro. That is exactly the right thing they should be doing, because forget about the critical response, commercial response, which I think is the most important factor, is that shared universes are always more valuable.
That's right. I'm excited. I like the original G.I. Joes. Pete, I did the dirty work of watching all the Transformers films just to remind myself about them.
Kudos to you.
If I'm ranking them, I would put this one probably second to the bottom. The Last Night is the absolute pits, although you need to watch it. You need to watch it just so that you can be as befuddled as I was about exactly what is the plot.
Okay, I'll put it on my watch list.
Put it on the watch list.
With protest.
With protest.
Listeners, if you think The Last Night was as bad as Ethan thinks it is, did you like Rise of the Beasts, or as I call it, Beast Wars? Let us know. Reach out to us. You can, of course, as always, like this video and leave a comment below. And, of course, subscribe to our channel. You can tweet at us at FNS Podcast. You can DM us on Instagram at Films and Stuff Podcast, or email us aloha@filmsandstuffpodcast.com.
We'll be here, and we'll have more reviews coming up this summer. Next week, I guess we got to do The Flash, huh?
Next weekend, we'll be rolling out, as it were, to see The Flash.
Thanks, Optimus Primus. All right, everybody. Thank you for joining Pete and myself on Films and Stuff Podcast. We will catch you next episode. More reviews coming your way.
Thanks, Ethan.
Thanks.
Thank you for listening to another episode of Films and Stuff. If you haven't already, please subscribe and review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever podcasts are downloaded. Films and Stuff. There is no substitute.